You might think that at a certain age, nothing can surprise you anymore, that your role in the family is set, your voice softened, and the world just moves around you without listening. That's what I believed too. Until one quiet evening, after a family dinner where my heart was bruised in silence, I realized I had one last story to tell in this time. It wouldn't be told with sighs or silence, but with a letter. Not a letter of confrontation, not one of anger, but an apology letter that carried more truth than anyone expected. What happened after that changed everything, and not just for me. So stay with me through this story, not just to hear what the letter said, but to see how one moment of courage can turn an entire family's heart back home. It didn't happen overnight. These things rarely do. A fracture in the heart of a family begins like a faint hairline, cracked so thin you don't notice, so silent you don't hear it coming. But over time, with every careless word, every dismissed gesture, every moment of arrogance left unchallenged, that crack deepens, spreads, until one day it splits everything wide open. That was what happened between me and my grandson, Evan. Evan wasn't always like this. I remember the boy who used to run into my arms after school, dragging his muddy backpack behind him, showing me his messy drawings like they were treasures. I was the one who taught him how to ride a bike, who held his hand during his first vaccination, who whispered stories into his ear when his mother was too tired to stay up. I loved him with a part of my heart that I didn't even know existed until the day he was born. But something changed, slowly, painfully. Maybe it was the years. Maybe it was the way his parents raised him, so permissive, so indulgent. Maybe it was the screens and social media that taught him pride before empathy. Or maybe it was just life and the way it erodes bonds that aren't watered every day. Whatever the reason, by the time Evan was 16, the boy who used to bring me flowers on my birthday had become someone else entirely. He stopped greeting me when I visited. He rolled his eyes when I spoke. He laughed sarcastically at my old-fashioned advice, once even mimicking my trembling hands in front of his friends at a family barbecue. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying his laughter in my head, so careless, so cruel. I told myself he was just a teenager, but the truth settled in my chest like a stone. Respect had left his heart, and I had become just another shadow in his world. Still, I said nothing. I was raised in a different time. We didn't shout or make scenes. We kept pain in our pockets and tried to lead by example. I tried to smile through it all, to offer him snacks when he walked past me, to compliment his new clothes, to pretend like I didn't hear him scoffing at me under his breath. I swallowed my pride again and again until it began to sour inside me. One evening, the final straw came in with a shout, but with silence. It was Evan's birthday. The family had gathered at my daughter's house for dinner. The table was full, the food was warm, and the laughter was flowing. I had even taken the time to bake Evan's favorite cake chocolate with orange zest, just the way he liked it when he was 10. I wrapped his gift carefully, an antique watch that had belonged to his great-grandfather. I had kept it safe for years, waiting for the day I could pass it on. I believed, foolishly, that maybe this gift would stir something in him, remind him of our shared blood, our history. But when I handed it to him, Evan didn't even look me in the eye. He opened it in front of everyone, stared at the watch for a moment, then said with a smirk, thanks, I guess. Then, turning to his friend beside him, he whispered, loud enough for me to hear, "What am I supposed to do with this dinosaur thing?" Everyone laughed. I froze. It wasn't just what he said, it was the tone. It was the way no one at the table stood up for me. It was the look on my daughter's face, half embarrassed but unwilling to say anything. It was the way I suddenly felt small, invisible, like some relic from a time no one respected anymore. I stood there, cake knife still in hand, heart thudding in my ears. My eyes burned, but no tears came. I nodded once, quietly, and walked to the sink, pretending to wash something so no one would see the flush on my cheeks. But in my chest, something had broken not like a twig, but like a dam. And what poured out was not anger, it was resolve. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. I wasn't sad anymore. I was tired. Tired of being the family's silent punching bag. Tired of watching a boy I love drift so far away from decency? Tired of the excuse that he's just young? No. Evan was old enough to know better, old enough to hurt, and old enough to face consequences. But I didn't want revenge. What I wanted, no, what I needed was to remind him who I was, not just his grandmother, not just the woman who made soup and sat in the corner during family games. I was the one who carried generations of love and strength in her hands. I was the memory keeper, the bridge. And I refused to be forgotten or mocked like some foolish old fool who didn't know the world had moved on. So I decided to write. It wouldn't be a confrontation. It wouldn't be a scolding. It would be a letter delicate, graceful, but sharp enough to pierce through that thick wall of arrogance Evan had built around himself. A letter not written in anger, but in the cool, calm voice of someone who had lived too long to waste time shouting. An apology, yes but one, wrapped in truths he couldn't ignore. It would carry my pain, my memories, and my final message as a grandmother who deserved respect, not pity. I stayed up until dawn, crafting each sentence with the precision of a surgeon. I folded the letter carefully, placed it in a cream envelope, and wrote his name in cursive on the front. And then I waited, because sometimes silence is louder than fury, and a whisper, delivered at the right moment, can shake the ground far more than a scream ever could. Little did I know, that single letter would not only reach his heart, it would bring him to his knees. The next morning, the air was unusually still. Even the birds outside seemed quieter, as if they too sensed a shift. I sat at the breakfast table, hands clasped loosely around a cold cup of tea, staring at the envelope I had written Evan's name on the night before. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind. Would it even matter to him? Would he tear it up without reading a single line? Would I become a laughingstock again, mocked for being too sensitive, too old, too out of touch? But none of those questions changed what I felt in my bones. Something had to be said, not in anger, not in bitterness, but with dignity. My words would not scream, they would haunt. So I opened my notebook. The first line came to me as if whispered by an ancestor, soft and powerful. Dear Evan, I'm writing to apologize, but not in the way you think. The pen moved slowly at first, my hand still shaking slightly from the night before. But as the ink flowed across the page, so did the truth. I wrote not just for him, but for myself, for every time I had smiled through hurt, for every moment I had kept silent when I should have spoken, for every elder who had been brushed aside in favor of youth's ego. I wrote like a woman who had nothing left to prove and nothing to lose. I told him that I was sorry for having expected respect simply because I had earned it, not realizing that the world had changed so much that even basic decency now required negotiation. I was sorry that my generation taught restraint while his embraced reaction. I was sorry that perhaps, in loving him too much, I had never shown him the value of boundaries. But more than that, I was sorry that he had mistaken my silence for weakness and my kindness for irrelevance. And then I began to unravel the history he never cared to know. I wrote about the nights I stayed up making clothes by hand when his mother was little, sewing until my fingers bled just so she wouldn't feel the shame of poverty. I wrote about carrying heavy baskets through rain just to sell vegetables at the market when his grandfather was bedridden with fever. I wrote about how, even in the hardest years, I never missed a school recital, a birthday, or a scraped knee. But those were not stories of self-pity, they were reminders. Reminders that the wrinkles on my face were not symbols of decay, but of battles survived. That my trembling hands once held entire generations together. That I did not live 70 years just to be dismissed by someone barely out of adolescence. I reminded him gently but firmly that respect is not an antique idea, it is the foundation of humanity. And that those who forget their roots, no matter how tall they grow, will one day find the wind much stronger at the top. Not because the world is cruel, but because life has a way of humbling the arrogant in ways they never expect. I did not insult him. I did not curse him. That would have been too easy and too expected. Instead, I thanked him. I thanked him for the lesson, for showing me the truth, for allowing me, perhaps for the last time in my life, to speak clearly and courageously without fear of how it would be received. Because by hurting me so deeply, he had forced me to remember who I truly was. And I ended the letter with a simple sentence that I hoped would echo in the corners of his conscience for years. Sometimes, Evan, it is the quietest voices that leave the loudest echoes. When I sealed the envelope, my heart wasn't heavy. It was strong, clear, alive. There was no longer any doubt in me. Whether he read it or not, whether he understood it or not, this letter would be my final gift to him. Not the watch, not the cake, this. Words dipped in memory, pressed with quiet fire, but how to deliver it? That was the question that lingered like incense in the room. Should I leave it on his bed quietly? Should I hand it to his mother to pass along? Should I mail it, making it seem impersonal and distant? None of those felt right. They were too convenient, too comfortable, and Evan had grown far too comfortable thinking there were no consequences to his words. No, he needed to hear it, not just in private, but in the presence of the very people who had laughed along with him, because this wasn't just a letter, it was a reckoning, a mirror, a soft, sharp blade made not of revenge, but of reflection. So I made a decision I had never made in my life. I would read it aloud. My daughter had invited us all to Sunday dinner the following week, another family gathering. My mind was clear. That would be the place. That would be the moment. I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't point fingers. I would simply stand up, paper in hand, and let the letter speak for itself. Let it rise like mist in the room and find its way into every silent corner. But as the day approached, the doubt returned. Not fear, just uncertainty. Would they interrupt me? Would they try to stop me halfway? Would they laugh again, brush it off as the dramatics of an old woman nearing her twilight? Still, I didn't waver, because sometimes the most powerful thing an elder can do is not shout at the fire, but become the fire. A calm, controlled burn that clears the weeds so something better can grow. When Sunday came, I dressed carefully, not out of vanity, but respect. I wore the same dress I wore to Evan's christening, a pale lavender one with white embroidery. I pinned on my mother's brooch. I brushed my silver hair back and placed the letter into my purse like a sacred text. And as I looked into the mirror one last time, I did not see a weak old woman. I saw the matriarch of a family that had forgotten how to honor its roots. I arrived early. I helped set the table, smiled politely, laughed at jokes, and watched Evan from across the room as he scrolled on his phone, oblivious. At one point, he glanced at me and smirked again just for a second, but it was enough. And then, just before dessert was served, I cleared my throat and stood. "Before we eat," I said, voice calm but unwavering, "I'd like to say a few words. I've written a small letter, an apology, actually, and I think it's time you all heard it." The room fell silent. Evan looked up, confused. My daughter opened her mouth to say something, but I raised my hand gently, not with authority, but with grace. I unfolded the paper, took a deep breath, and began to read. What happened next would change everything. I began reading the letter as if reciting a prayer. My voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence like a blade through silk. The air shifted instantly, forks paused mid-air, glasses trembled in suspended hands, and the once flickering chatter of casual dinner talk vanished into a silence so dense it felt like the walls themselves were listening. I could hear every breath in the room. I could feel every eye fixed on Minot in curiosity, but in something closer to disbelief. Evan, at first, leaned back lazily, half amused, as though he were expecting a sentimental ramble, but his expression began to change by the second sentence. By the third, his fingers had stopped tapping the side of his chair. By the fourth, he was no longer smirking. I wasn't reading it with vengeance. No tremble of bitterness touched my words, but the calm in my tone made every sentence more powerful, more devastating. I could feel the shift in the room as I went on. At first, the words dripped like water, but soon they flowed like a river's low, unstoppable, and washing away every mask that had been worn for far too long in that family. I spoke about the cake, about the antique watch, about the way he had looked at me like I was nothing more than a museum artifact. I quoted the exact words he had whispered, "What am I supposed to do with this dinosaur thing?" and I watched as his cheeks slowly turned crimson. I could see the discomfort ripple across the room like a stone dropped in a still pond. His mother shifted in her seat, avoiding my gaze. His father coughed lightly, pretending to sip water. No one said a word. But I wasn't done, not even close. I recounted how I had rocked him to sleep when he was a baby, walking circles in the living room until my knees ached, how I had spent a month's pension to fix his laptop when it broke before his exams, without ever mentioning it, how I had once walked 3 kilometers in the summer sun just to get him a book he wanted for school. I told the room how much I had loved him, and how deeply it had wounded me to realize that he now viewed me as something disposable, laughable, obsolete. I could see Evan blinking rapidly now, his jaw tightening. He tried to hide it, but the sheen in his eyes betrayed him. Then I paused. I closed my eyes for a moment and allowed the weight of silence to land. In that space, no one could hide. And then I went further. I reminded not just Evan, but everyone at that table, how easily we take the elderly for granted. How easy it is to forget that the hands that now tremble were once the hands that fed, protected, built, and carried. I reminded them that youth may be loud and fast, but it does not erase the quiet dignity of those who came before. And then came the line I had written with the most care, the one that tied it all together. Respect does not belong to the young or the old. It belongs to those who remember that love is not a birthright, but a responsibility. I saw it. That moment, the breaking point. Evan suddenly stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, and everyone turned to him in alarm. His face was pale, his hands clenched. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Instead, he turned to Mayhe's eyes full of something I hadn't seen in years. Not rebellion, not annoyance, but shame. He took a step forward, then another, and then he dropped to his knees. Right there, in front of everyone. The sound was soft, but the impact was thunderous. Gasps filled the room. His friend, seated at the far end of the table, looked stunned. His mother clutched her napkin, her eyes wide. His father's hand froze halfway to his mouth. It was as if time had stopped. "I'm sorry, Grandma," Evan whispered, his voice cracking like a boy lost in a storm. "I didn't know. I never thought. I was just stupid. I'm so sorry." Tears slipped down his face. Not loud, not theatrical, but real. Undeniable. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. I looked down at him, this boy who had once run into my arms, now crumpled in apology before my feet. And in that moment, I saw both the child he had been and the man he was becoming. My heart, wounded but not hardened, softened again. Not because I needed revenge, but because this raw moment of humility was the beginning of something deeper than punishment. It was understanding. I placed my hand gently on his head, like I had done when he was a child afraid of the dark. "It's never too late to remember who you are," I said softly. "But remembering must lead to change. Otherwise, it's just guilt dressed in silence." He nodded, sobbing harder now. The room remained hushed, every guest holding their breath, unsure if they had just witnessed a family fall apart or come back together. Then, slowly, I folded the letter again and placed it on the table. "I have nothing more to say," I said quietly. "I think the letter said enough." And with that, I walked out of the dining room, leaving behind a silence so thick it hummed. In the days that followed, everything changed. The dynamics of the family shifted, not immediately, but undeniably. My daughter called the next morning, her voice shaking with both gratitude and regret. Evan came to visit, this time with flowers and no phone in his hand. He asked me to tell him more stories. He asked questions about the watch, about his great-grandfather, about how I had met his grandfather. And this time, he listened. Really listened. He began visiting more often, quietly, respectfully, helping with the garden, sitting beside me, not across the room. And once, during a quiet afternoon, he looked at me and said, "I'll never forget the day you taught me the meaning of respect without raising your voice." The letter had not just changed Evan. It had opened the eyes of everyone who heard it. But most importantly, It reminded me of something I had almost forgotten in my own pain, that the truth, when spoken with grace and resolve, doesn't just confront it, transforms. And sometimes, kneeling is not about defeat. It's about returning to the ground we forgot we came from. In the silence that followed my departure from the dining room, Evan remained on his knees. No one told him to get up. No one dared to. His friend had long since looked away, awkward and embarrassed. His parents sat frozen in their chairs, their guilt plastered on their faces like thick, dripping paint, visible, undeniable. The weight of the moment hung in the air like a bell that had been rung and was still echoing through the bones of everyone present. And yet, even with all eyes on him, Evan didn't move. Because something inside him had finally cracked not in a way that destroys, but in the rare way that allows light to flood in. The boy who had once mocked my trembling hands was now holding his own in front of his face, shaking not from fear, but from the weight of realization. It wasn't just about the words he had spoken or the gift he had ridiculed. It was the years of indifference, the careless comments, the eye rolls, the way he had taken my presence for granted, as if I'd always be around eternal, unfeeling, unshakable. But now, for the first time in his life, Evan saw me, truly saw me. Not as the old woman sitting quietly in a corner, but as a full, living story woven from sacrifice, struggle, tenderness, and strength. A keeper of history, a protector of memory, and, above all, a human being worthy of honor, not mockery. He stood slowly, not because he was ready to move on, but because he couldn't remain in that posture of remorse forever. His legs were stiff, his pride crumpled in his chest. His mother reached out to touch his arm, but he shook his head gently and walked out of the dining room. No one followed. He wandered outside, into the garden where the late sunlight was beginning to dim. It was golden and quiet, the way endings often are. The old bench under the bougainvillea bush where I had once told him bedtime stories as a child stood empty. He sat there now, hunched forward, his elbows on his knees, hands dangling between his legs as if the weight of his own thoughts was too much to carry upright. And he cried. Not the shallow, dramatic cries of a teenager desperate for attention, but the soul-deep cries of someone who has just seen their reflection and found it wanting. The kind of crying that doesn't come with noise, just heaving shoulders and silent prayers for forgiveness. The kind of crying that empties a person out, only to make room for growth. What haunted him the most wasn't what I had said, it was what I hadn't. The grace with which I delivered my pain, the way I hadn't shouted or accused. The way my voice had held firm, not from rage, but from the quiet certainty that I had lived long enough not to waste energy proving myself to someone who had forgotten who I was. That was what broke him. The next morning, before sunrise, Evan came to my house. I had barely begun boiling water for tea when I heard the knock. It wasn't the hesitant tap of a boy unsure of himself. It was steady, solid, the kind of knock that says, "I've come not just to say sorry, but to take responsibility." I opened the door to find him standing there, holding the letter. "I read it again," he said. His voice was hoarse from crying. "Twice. Then I couldn't sleep." I gestured for him to come in, and he did without his phone, without distractions. He looked around my small living room as if seeing it for the first time. The lace curtains I'd sewn by hand, the worn but clean carpet, the wooden frames full of black and white memories. My life on quiet display. We sat across from each other. For a moment, he said nothing. Then he placed the letter on the table between us and looked me in the eyes. "Grandma," he said, "I didn't just disrespect you. I erased you. From my world, from my thoughts. I treated you like you were just there. But you weren't just there. You were everything behind me, everything that made it possible for me to be where I am." He inhaled deeply, collecting himself. "I've been selfish, arrogant. I thought old meant out of touch. I thought kindness meant weakness. But I was wrong. I see now, you didn't lose your voice. I just wasn't listening." His words weren't perfect, but they didn't have to be. They were real. I poured him tea. He took the cup with both hands carefully this time. respectfully, and we sat there in silence for several minutes. A silence that didn't need to be filled, a silence that healed. He told me about the guilt that clung to him after the dinner, how he couldn't look in the mirror without hearing my words. He admitted that the letter had stirred memories in him he thought were long gone. My hands holding his when he had nightmares, my stories under the covers, my voice cheering at his school plays, even the warmth of my scarf wrapped around his neck during winter walks. I remembered it all, Grandma, he said, tears gathering in his eyes again. It was like the letter unblocked something. It brought me back to the boy I used to be, the one who loved you, who admired you. I miss him, and I miss you, even though you're right here. I reached out and touched his face. He leaned into my palm. Then find him again, I whispered, and bring him back with you. From that day forward, Evan began to change not out of obligation, but out of love. He visited me every week, not just to chat, but to help fixing the gate, sweeping the porch, helping me with groceries. But it wasn't the physical acts that mattered most. It was his presence, his attentiveness, the way he listened, the way he spoke to me and about me, with pride instead of embarrassment. He told his friends about me now. He once posted a picture of my old bookshelf online with the caption, "My grandmother's mind is sharper than any podcast. Sit with your elders, you might learn something." But even beyond me, the letter rippled into the rest of the family. My daughter began checking in more often. My son-in-law, never a man of many words, asked me one day if I could tell him the story of how I survived the war. "I think it's time our kids hear it too," he said. The family that had once placed me at the fringe was now building its circle around me. And Evan, Evan, he didn't become perfect. No one does. But he became awake, present, humble, and perhaps most importantly, he carried the letter with him, physically and emotionally. He once told me he kept it in his desk drawer, right under his laptop, and read it every time he started to forget. That was all I could ask for. Because in the end, I didn't write that letter to make him kneel. I wrote it to make him rise, not in pride, but in awareness, in respect, in love. And though I may not live to see the man he will fully become, I rest easy knowing that the seed has been planted. That in the moment when it mattered most, the truth took root in his heart and blossomed into something far greater than punishment. It became redemption. The weeks that followed felt like a season turning quietly subtle at first, but unmistakable once you stopped and looked around. In our family, there had always been noise. Laughter layered with sarcasm. Dinners filled with updates about school, promotions, sales figures, diet trends, arguments disguised as jokes. But for the first time in years, there was stillness. Not an awkward silence, but a listening silence. A silence that said, "We're paying attention now." It wasn't just Evan who changed, though he remained the most visible symbol of it. My daughter began calling more often, not to ask for help or unload complaints, but simply to ask how I was doing. She told me one afternoon, as we folded laundry together, "I didn't realize how much I expected you to just be here. Always. Like a light in the corner we never switch off but rely on to see." Her voice cracked slightly as she said it, and I reached over and squeezed her hand. The grandchildren, Evan's younger cousins, started watching me with new eyes. One evening, the youngest, Chloe, asked if I could show her how to sew. "Not on YouTube, Grandma. I want to learn it from your hands," she said, placing her tiny fingers in my wrinkled palm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In that moment, I felt something powerful like the link between past and future had been reforged, ironed smooth by the fire of that letter. And Evan, Evan had become the quiet center of the family's new gravity. He spoke less, but with more weight. When his friends came over now, he introduced Minot just with name, but with honor. "This is my grandmother," he'd say. "She's lived more than all of us combined." He started inviting me to his school events, asking my opinion on his essays, bringing me books, and even one say bouquet of wildflowers he had picked himself. And yet, for all the outward changes, the deepest shift was internal. Evan was different on the inside, more present, more self-aware. He once told me, "I've started noticing things. How you arrange the spoons in the drawer, how you fold napkins, how you remember everyone's favorite tea. It's like you were leaving clues all along, and I just never saw them. That sentence stayed with me. Because that's what we do, isn't it? Those of us who are aging quietly in the corners of bustling families, we leave clues, gentle gestures, acts of service, silent sacrifices. All tiny love letters written in a language most don't learn to read until it's nearly too late. But my letter me so-called apology had become the translation key, not just for Evan, but for the entire family. It had unsealed something in them, forced them to pause, to reflect, to recalibrate their sense of what really mattered. It also changed how they treated each other. I began to notice less shouting at the dinner table, more shared chores, more thank yous said aloud. My son-in-law, once allergic to emotions, now made a point of complimenting his children when they did something well. My daughter started writing little notes and slipping them into lunchboxes, something I used to do for her decades ago. Kindness was blooming again, like wildflowers growing from scorched soil. But not everyone outside understood. One day, Evan's friend from school, Jason, the same one who had laughed with him at the dinner, came over again. He looked around my home like it was a time capsule. At one point, he asked Evan privately, "Dude, are you seriously spending your Saturdays with your grandma now? What even happened to you?" Evan didn't get defensive. He didn't mock Jason back. He simply said, "I realized I was standing on a bridge I never built, and I was burning it without even looking down." Jason didn't respond, but he didn't laugh either. He sat down beside us while I showed Evan how to press flowers between pages, and he watched with a quiet curiosity, as if something inside him was beginning to stir too. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. But when spoken from the heart, it echoes. And sometimes, the echo travels farther than the voice ever could. One Sunday, our family gathered for dinner again, this time, by Evan's invitation. He cooked the main dish himself and made sure everyone had their favorite seat. When it was time to eat, he stood at the head of the table, cleared his throat, and said something I will never forget. "Before we start, I just want to say thank you, especially to Grandma, for giving me a second chance, for telling me the truth even when it hurt. That letter didn't just teach me about you. It taught me about myself. And I hope tonight, this dinner, is a small way of showing that I've been listening." There wasn't a dry eye at the table. And as we ate, laughed, and passed dishes hand to hand, I felt a lightness in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not because everything was perfect, now life never is, but because something had shifted at the core. The current had changed direction. The roots had reconnected. Even extended family began noticing. At reunions, I was no longer seated out of obligation, but out of honor. Relatives who hadn't called in years began to check in. Evan's story, what happened with the letter, began to spread. Slowly, whispered among cousins and in-laws, not as gossip, but as legend. As proof that sometimes, the quietest voice in the room holds the deepest wisdom. Months later, Evan came to me with a question. "Grandma," he said, "do you think I should share your letter publicly? Maybe anonymously? I think other people my age need to read it." I thought for a moment, then nodded. "Let it travel," I said. "Let it do what it was meant to do. Not punish, not shame, but wake people up." So we did. He typed it up, changed the names, and posted it on a blog. It was shared thousands of times. People wrote comments saying they called their grandparents that night. Others said it reminded them of elders they had lost and never thanked. Teachers read it in classrooms. A man from another country emailed Evan to say it made him cry for the first time in 20 years. The ripple continued. But through it all, Evan never forgot the origin. He came every Sunday without fail. Sometimes with flowers, sometimes with books, sometimes with nothing but his full attention. And once, as we sipped tea on the porch, he looked at me and said, "You know what scares me, Grandma? That I almost never figured this out. That if you hadn't written that letter, I might have just kept going, thinking I was right." I smiled gently. The ones who wake up just in time are often the ones who shine the brightest. And he did shine, not with arrogance, but with the quiet strength of a boy who had been broken open and had chosen to become better, not bitter. Now, as I write this, yes, I write Still, though my fingers ache more than they used to, I know that my time may not stretch far into the future. But I also know that the future is brighter than it was before. Because one letter, born from hurt but written in love, had reminded an entire family of something we so often forget: that love without respect is noise, that presence without acknowledgement is absence, and that sometimes it takes the smallest voice to bring a family back to its heart. And so, my dear listener, it was never about making my grandchild kneel. It was about helping him rise with humility and love. That letter didn't just bridge a gap between generations. It awakened something in all of us, a reminder that behind every wrinkle is a history, and behind every quiet elder is a voice that deserves to be heard. If this story stirred something in you, maybe a memory, maybe a realization, don't let it fade. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment if you've ever been touched by a simple truth, or if you have a story like mine waiting to be told. And if you believe that respect, once lost, can still be reclaimed, then like this video. And subscribe to stay close to more stories that matter. Because sometimes it takes just one letter to change everything.